I just need to forget it. Then everyone will be safe." Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow at the kid who'd come tearing in here like the world was on fire. She didn't get kids very often. It was usually just adults that wanted her help. She had certainly never gotten an unaccompanied child in here in the whole time she'd been open, and Juliet looked fairly frazzled when she had called Pamela out to help her with the babbling middle schooler. Dr. Winter had been prepared to send the kid on his way, maybe even call his parents if he was someone she knew from town. But one look at the kid had shown her that he needed a little bit more than directions. "What is it you think is after you, Mr. Sid?" the kid said. It's hard to explain. My friend Ralphie and I never meant to hurt anybody. We were tired of Danny always having the good stories. We wanted some stories that would make people scared, but we took it a little too far." The cup in his hand shook fitfully, and Pamela was a little afraid he was going to spill tea on the carpet. As he took a sip, she was glad to see that some of the shakes erased in his hands. "Why don't you start from the beginning? I find it always helps to start from the beginning." Sid nodded. I guess it all started in the gym equipment room. It all started with Danny and his scary stories." Marky banged on the door, his eyes beginning to tear up as he called for help. He'd gone into the equipment shed looking for answers, and what he found scared him nearly to death. As he banged on the door, he could hear the creature pulling itself free of the wall behind him. The massive paws came to rest on the ground, the claws clittering on the pavement, and he could almost feel the rumbles as the beast came for him. I put a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, but Terrence didn't seem to have any such hesitation. He moaned like a trained mourner in a soap opera, and Ralphie slapped a hand over his gaping mouth as he leaned forward in expectation. Danny had us all in the grip of his story, and he knew it. He continued to weave his tale as I tempered my excitement with the reminder to listen for the approach of Coach Tyson. The handle, which had been unlocked when Marky came in, was as unyielding as the walls around him, and as the beast came closer and closer, Marky felt terror growing inside him, threatening to overtake him. I perked up my ears, having heard a noise from this side of the veil. Was it Coach Tyson looking for 4 missing students? Was it Coach Leanna coming to get something from the equipment shed? Was it a monster like the one in Danny's story that was stalking us from amidst the dusty football pads? Who could say? The monster leaned down over him, its breath hot against his ear as it spoke. "I told you what would happen if I caught you in my lair again. Now I'm prepared to make good on that promise." Something wet fell onto Marky's shoulder, the spittle dribbling down as it prepared to rip his head off. We were all leaning in, our heads close enough to be clonked together like the Three Stooges, just waiting for the thrust. When the door opened suddenly, Marky fell into the hallway. Coach Blashkowitz looked shocked, and Marky crawled behind his legs as he looked into the equipment room, the creature nowhere to be seen. As if on cue, the door came open, and Coach Tyson poked his head in with a dramatic, "Aha!" He acted like he had caught 4 weasels in his hen house, but he couldn't have been that surprised to find us there. We met here in the equipment shed every chance we got, and we were constantly ditching gym class to tell spooky stories. "I thought I'd find you 4 in here. If you intend to finish your mile in the allotted time, you better hurry. There's 20 minutes left in class, and I think it's going to take every bit for you guys to get to the finish line on time." I squinted owlishly as I came out, the sun very bright after being in the depths of the equipment shed. I rolled my eyes as I saw Justin and his friends, Ryan and Frank, sitting on the grass by the finish line. Coach Tyson probably hadn't even noticed we were missing until those three had finished their laps, and now we had less than 20 minutes to run a mile. Coach shouted for us to get a move on, so we got a move on and started beating feet. As we ran, I asked Danny if he had meant for the coach to burst in his story too. Absolutely. You didn't really think I was going to let the monster get Marky, did you? I had, but I didn't say as much. Sucks he found us. I had a great story planned for today too. Danny laughed and made me feel a little angry. What's so funny? Nothing personal, but your stories kind of blow. I slowed a little, not quite wanting to understand him, before speeding up to catch up with the group. What do you mean? My stories are as good as yours. They weren't, and I knew they weren't, but my pride was hurt, and I wanted to vent. Danny looked like he was going to answer, but Terrence beat him to it. No way, dude. Danny's stories are the best. Your stories sound like something that wouldn't make it on a Creepypasta website. It wasn't what Terrence said that got me. He was too stupid to chew gum and walk, but it was the little nod that Danny gave in return that really rankled me. I was still thinking about it as Ralphie and I rode the bus on the way home, Ralphie trying to cheer me up. Come on, buck up. Danny isn't such hot crap. Stupid Danny, I groused, doodling on my pad as I sulked. Thinks he's such hot crap just because he's in Mrs. Herkimer's creative writing class, just because Mrs. Herkimer invited him to the 8th grade writing club after school. I can write just as good as he can. Ralphie was watching me doodle over my shoulder, and he raised an eyebrow as the picture took shape. Who's this fella you're drawing here? I looked down, not paying attention to what I was doodling, and I almost started. I'd drawn a large, muscled man, his face bulbous and ugly. One eye bulged from his skull, while the other seemed too deep in the socket. His cheeks were puffed out like a chipmunk, holding nuts for the winter. He had a hump, one shoulder higher than the other, and his arms ended not in hands, but in rounded tumors that had scabrous bulges on them and looked to be trickling pus or something. He had no fingers, no knuckles, but those big, round bulges at the end of his arms. Billy, I said, absent-minded again, though it was from the shock of this creature. Billy? Ralphie asked, the bus jouncing him as it took off. Billy Gumballs, I said, drawing a pair of overalls onto him. I added large gum rubber boots without socks and a few more veins on his rounded knot hands. I drew an undershirt, but erased it. It didn't seem right, and it looked better without it. He was bullied in high school for being different, and they called him Billy Gumballs because his cheeks bulged like he was chewing too much gum. When he was snubbed by his crush for the school dance, he murdered the kids at the dance and disappeared before the police arrived. The school was abandoned after that, and now the local kids think the place is haunted. They're right, because Billy still lives there, and he kills anyone who comes into his school. Ralphie listened, nodding along as the story came together. The bus rumbled away from the school and towards our street. I told him how 4 middle school kids had gone into the old school on a dare, and how each of them had run afoul of Billy Gumballs. Only the last kid had survived, and Billy had let him go so he could tell his story, and people would be afraid of him. The kids died in the usual horror movie ways, but mostly they were crushed by the heavy tumor hands of Billy Gumballs. I illustrated some as I talked, and as the bus stopped at Ralphie's house, he smacked my arm and told me I'd written a real great story there. What story? I asked. All I'd been doing was doodling and talking. Your Billy Gumballs story, of course. You should tell it tomorrow. I bet Danny wouldn't say it blowed. I realized he was right, and what's more, I realized I could do one thing better than just tell it. As I got home, I lay on the couch and started drawing it out. I could make a horror comic out of it, something that even Danny couldn't do, and then I could impress him. That'd show Danny whose stories blow. I drew the last couple of panels as I lay in bed that night, and when I tucked it into my backpack, I couldn't wait for school the next day. I worked on the cover as I rode the bus that morning, and when I stepped off, I was excited to show it to Danny. I was so excited, I ran right into Ryan and Justin and Frank. "What you got there, nerd?" Justin said, seeing the hand-drawn comic under my arm. "Nothing," I said hastily, trying to get past the trio. Justin and his friends, aside from being good at gym, were pretty big bullies in my grade, and when Ryan deftly took the comic from under my arm, I cawed and told him to give it back. "Billy Gumballs," he said, tossing it to Justin as they played keep-away with it. "What the hell is this?" "It's a school project," I lied, trying to get it back from him. "Come on, give it back before you wreck it." Justin opened it, thumbing through the pages as he deftly avoided me. "Huh, not too bad for a baby," he said, tearing one of the pages in half and letting it fall to the ground. You can probably guess what happened after that. By the time the bell rang, I was left on my knees in the hallway, trying not to cry as I salvaged the pages of the comic. It was ruined, wrecked beyond repair, and as I sat in homeroom and seethed, I knew just what I would do. I'd make another one, but instead of 4 friends going to find Billy, it'd be 4 bullies. I'm not sure why. There was no reason to do it, but as I remade the comic, Danny became the leader of the bullies. He hadn't done anything worse than offering honest criticism, but I couldn't help but think of him as responsible for this too. Without Danny, I would have never drawn the comic. Without Danny, it would never have existed to be destroyed in the first place. No one survived this time. They were all killed by Billy Gumballs, and as I finished the last page, I felt a weird surge course through the hairs on my arm. It reminded me of something my grandma had said. It reminded me of having a goose walk over my grave. When the bell rang, I found my friends by the stairwell, waiting for me before we went into English. Ralphie nudged Danny, who was standing off and looking guilty, and when he walked up, he rubbed the back of his neck as he apologized. I was sure that Ralphie had put him up to it, but the longer it went on, the more genuine it seemed. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what I said affected you like that. I really didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Ralphie said you've been working on something cool. I'd love to see it, if you want me to." I wanted to say something, but I was dumbstruck. Suddenly, the comic in my hand felt like an accusation, and the last thing I wanted to do was hand it to Danny. It's not quite done yet," I said, pushing it behind my back. "I don't want to show it to you until it's perfect." Danny nodded, clearly wanting to see, but still feeling guilty about what he had said the day before. "That's cool. I'd still be glad to look at it when it's done. Ralphie's been talking about this Billy Gumballs all through homeroom. He sounds pretty cool." I filled Danny in on some of the details, slipping the comic into my bag as we walked to class. I would redraw it later, I decided. I was a so-so storyteller, but I was good at drawing, and I knew I could make another one before the end of the day. I'd just draw Justin and his friends getting smashed up by Billy. That would be fine. Danny had apologized, but I was still mad at those bullies that had wrecked up my original comic. I doodled in English and did some more in math class. By social studies, I was getting close to completing it, and as the lunch bell rang, I put the finishing touches on it yet again. It was weird, though. When I got done, I didn't get that same feeling I'd gotten on the one I'd made earlier. This time it just felt normal, like it always did when I completed a drawing. I shook it off, figuring it was just nerves, and took it to the cafeteria to show my friends. We spent the lunch period marveling at the intricate ways that Billy Gumballs smashed and bashed the 3 boys who had made our lives a living hell since kindergarten. Danny laughed more than he looked afraid, but when he tapped the comic with the back of his hand and declared it to be the best story I'd ever written, I felt proud of myself. The guilt I had for the one that I had hidden in my backpack was gone, and I felt like maybe we could begin to get past it. When a scream erupted from the hallway outside the cafeteria, we all ran to see what had happened. It was Vanessa Franks, and she was pointing to the crumpled form of Justin's friend, Fred. He was leaning against one of the lockers, his head a little more than a pulpy melon. We would learn later that his skull had been caved in, the bones shattered like an egg. Vanessa had been on her phone, not really paying attention to where she was going, and slipped in the pool of blood that had formed just beneath them. That was why she had been screaming. She had slipped and looked up into the ruined face of her classmate and nearly lost her mind. They came and took the body away, but all of us were in the gymnasium by that point. They had moved all the students there and locked the school down while they searched for the killer. They felt pretty confident that whoever had done it, they had to be in the building, and they would have enough blood on them that they would know what they had done. Beating Fred to death would have left quite a lot of damage to them as well, and the teachers and the police had interviewed most of the students to see if they could narrow down the suspects. My friends and I were chattering about the murder, but I was on pins and needles. They had forgotten about my comic, and thank God for that. The one they had seen, however, wasn't the one I was worried about. It was the comic in my bag that made me afraid. If the cops found that comic, I'd have a lot of questions to answer, and they would probably be answered in a little room at the police station. There was a picture in that comic of Fred with his head smashed against a locker, and it looked very similar to the scene upstairs. Fred had been the first victim, and when Justin turned to Danny to ask what they were going to do now, Danny had told them that they would find who had done this and put him down like a dog. "It's weird, isn't it?" Ralphie said, bringing me out of my contemplation. "What's weird?" "You drew a comic about those bullies getting killed, and then one of them got his head caved in." I agreed it was pretty weird, reflecting that I was glad the one I had shown them had featured Fred getting thrown down the stairs. "You..." Ralphie started, wetting his lips as if not sure how to begin. "You didn't have anything to do with that, did you?" I wanted to deny it right away, but I was having trouble forming a good argument. Of course I didn't have anything to do with it. How could he even think such a thing? Just because I'd drawn something similar didn't mean I had anything to do with this. "How could I, Ralphie? I was in the cafeteria with you guys when it happened. Remember?" Ralphie nodded, but the look he gave me was still pretty hard. They put us all on buses and sent us home not long after that. We were assured that school would be back in session tomorrow, but we weren't so sure. They still hadn't found the killer, not a trace of him, and Fred's parents were distraught. The bus Ralphie and I had been on had driven past his mother as we pulled off, and she was shaking in tears as she sat on a bench outside the office. Seeing that made me feel guilty all over again, but I wasn't sure why. Ralphie didn't talk much on the ride home, and the goodbye he gave me as he climbed off was decidedly muted. I wonder if he really thought I had done this, and as my stop came up, I decided I wanted a nap instead of TV this afternoon. I tossed my backpack down when I got home and went to lie on the couch, but my nap just wouldn't come. When the phone rang a little while later, I got up and answered it groggily. It was Thursday, so Mom wouldn't get off till 5, and Dad wouldn't be in till after bedtime. I had the house to myself until about 5:30, but I wished that they had been here. I needed to talk to somebody about this, about the guilt I was feeling for some reason, and I just knew that my parents would help me out. I found Terrence on the other end of the phone, and he sounded hysterical. "They found Ryan's body this afternoon at the school." I sat up straighter, not sure if I was awake or still dreaming. "What do you mean?" I asked. He was on the bus home, same as the rest of us." "I know, but my dad called me about 10 minutes ago all spazzy. He said that one of the officers had been searching for the guy under the bleachers in the gym when he found Ryan all crumpled up under there. He was beaten to a pulp, and he wanted to know if I'd locked the door and was being safe. I told him I was, and he told me to go upstairs and lock myself in my room until my mom got home. I'm scared. I don't know what's going on, but it sounds like kids at our school are getting killed." No, I thought as the phone slipped out of my hand. Not just any kids at our school. Kids that I had drawn in a comic, dying in the ways that they had been found dead. In the comic, the one I had hidden from my friends, Ryan had been dragged under the bleachers, and the group had found him later beaten to a pulp. A literal pulp. In the comic, they only knew it was him because of his sneakers, since the rest of his body was a pile of bloody meat. "Terrence, does your dad have any idea who's doing this?" I hedged, trying to find out if I was a suspect for some reason. "Not a clue, but the police are really scratching their heads." I hung up on Terrence and hovered over the number for Danny's house. I was hesitant to call him, wanting to worry him even less than I wanted to admit to having written this suddenly relevant comic. I dithered for a few before thumbing his number, listening to it ring before his mother grabbed it on the fourth one. She told me that Danny was at the pizzeria on Sherman, and she supposed he had forgotten his phone. She asked if I wanted to leave a message, but I told her that was fine. I was going to meet him at the pizzeria anyway. We hung up, and I grabbed my backpack as I headed out. My timing must have been impeccable, because I caught him just as his pie arrived at the table. "Hey, you feel like a slice too?" he asked, inviting me to sit. "Nah," I said, taking the comic out of my bag. "I need to come clean with you. I could overlook the first one as an accident, but after they found Ryan dead too, I don't think I can overlook it. This was the comic I did earlier today. Something I wrote while I was mad at Justin and his friends." Danny looked at the cover, opening up and leafing through it. He raised an eyebrow when he saw himself leading the bullies. As he read, though, something strange happened. Far from being horrified, he began to laugh. When he came to Justin's death, the bully decapitated with a single punch, his head falling down the stairs and into the boiler room, Danny wiped an eye and looked at me in disbelief. He seemed confused that I wasn't laughing. "Oh, come on. Sure, it's scary, but it's also a bit over the top. It's almost cartoonish. 2 people have died in exactly the way I drew it. I'm the only one besides you who knows it exists, and I can't help but think it's a little bit serious. They'll put me in jail for this. They'll use this to put me in the electric chair down at Stragview. They'll think I murdered those kids." Danny shook his head. "There's no way you killed Fred. Ralphie and Terrence and I will attest to that. You were with us all through lunch, and I can't imagine that anyone would believe that a shrimp like you did that to Fred or Ryan," he said, holding open the book to the page in question. I was stunned, unsure what to do, and when he laughed again, I found myself laughing right along with him. How had I not seen this? They could testify that I hadn't been anywhere near either of those boys. The GPS on my phone could tell the police that I'd been at home all afternoon. There was no way to link me to any of this. I was safe. "Come on," Danny said. "Come hang out at my house till your mom gets home. Then I'll walk you home just to make sure that old Billy Gumballs doesn't get you." We laughed about it all the way back to his house, cracking jokes as we talked about the character. Danny said he had some ideas for what Billy could do next, though we'd have to keep real people out of the story this time. We couldn't have the police trying to claim that we were killing people through fiction, he said, and then we both were laughing all over again. As we came up the stairs to his room, I told him I was going to use the bathroom, and I'd catch him up. "Well, don't take too long. I'm going to get some Dead by Daylight going so we can play co-op." I said that sounded great, and we parted ways. I was standing at the toilet when I suddenly remembered something. In the comic, Danny had gotten away in the end, but Billy had been waiting for him when he came home. He'd come out of his closet, I reflected, and smashed his head after sneaking up on him from behind. I started to run to him, but I stopped as I zipped up my pants, remembering what Danny had said. It was just a coincidence. Nothing like that happened in real life. Heck, I thought as I flushed, I bet Justin was safe and sound at his house as I was thinking about this. I shook my head as I let the water flow over my hands. Such an idiot. I'd gotten myself all worked up over nothing. When I heard him scream from the next room, I came tearing out of the bathroom as my flimsy hope fell apart. I came running into the room, my hands still dripping wet, and that's when I saw him. Danny was sitting in his desk, the controller in his hand, with his head collapsed into his chest. Someone had driven his head in like a nail, and the perpetrator was still standing behind him, looking at me guiltily as he turned towards the door. I thought I was dreaming, that I was hallucinating, but as we stood looking at each other, I had to come to terms with the realness. His head was bald, his skin was pale, his cheeks looked like a squirrel preparing for winter. He wore overalls without a shirt under them, and gum rubber boots that were black as pitch. His hands were bloody, covered in old and new blood, but even so, no one would mistake them for real hands. They were rounded, a pair of bulbous tumors that sat at the end of each wrist, and when he turned to run, I yelled for him to wait. Instead, he jumped out the window and was gone. Winter sipped her tea and watched the boy as he struggled with the memory. He had brought up more than one. The memory's too big for a single pull, but she thought this might be the last one. His cup looked like it had buoys floating in it, and she doubted there would be room for another. Pamela reached over and took the cup, replacing it with a fresh one before he could make a mess. "What happened after that?" she asked, leading him. "I thought it was over, but then people started going missing. Hikers mostly, vagrants, people with car trouble, people I could have overlooked. It's just bad luck, bad weather, or human nature. Then it started killing kids. It came out of the woods and started lurking in town. The murders were the same. People beaten to a pulp, people's heads crushed, people broken up and smashed to pieces. That's when I knew he wasn't done." Winter was rarely surprised, but she was by this revelation. "Are you saying that this Billy Gumballs is the Gladdy Smasher?" The boy nodded, slow and dreamy. "I've tried to tell the police, but they don't believe me. They thought I was involved for a while after I showed them the comic, but now they just think I'm unwell. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am crazy. Crazy or not, I created him. I think the only way to get rid of him is to forget him. That's why I took the bus down here. That's why I came to beg you to help me. That's why I need you to make me forget." Winter put down her own cup and leaned forward. This was going to be a little different, but also more of the same. She rested her hands on top of his head, her fingers splayed over his scalp. "Sid, do me a favor. Think of the day you created that comic. Think of how you felt. Think of how you drew. Think of everything you did to make that creature, and hold it in your mind. Hold on to it, but not too tight. Push it up like a balloon towards the sky, and I'll catch it." He did just that, and as she drew out the memory, he shuddered all over as he brought the last of the bulbous memories up. "Like a goose walked over my grave," he whispered, and then he was still. An hour later, Winter was waving to him as he climbed onto the bus and headed the 50 miles or so up the road to Gladdy. She would watch the news with interest for the next few weeks, but it seemed that the Gladdy Smasher was done with his reign of terror. Sid had been right. It had been created from his own mind, and now that he had forgotten it, it existed no longer. Winter marveled as she walked back to the clinic that humans truly were fascinating creatures. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Sarah ASMR42, Grim Reaper, and TomBoiTopUwU for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a special thanks to Grim Reaper, who appears to have subscribed not just on YouTube, but also on my Patreon. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you, and your support is always appreciated. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon, or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early, at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. My time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.